everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I wanted to do a casual chatty get ready with me talking about my latest obsession, which is the novel All Fours by Miranda July. So for context, in case you're new to my channel, normally my videos are just reviews of luxury makeup products, but occasionally I like to share other things that I've been obsessed with. And I did one video of this format before, shortly after I watched the TV show Blue Eye Samurai, which is still my favorite TV show. And that video did pretty well, and I was really gratified to get a comment from the lead character designer for that show. So I thought it would be fun to do another video in that vein in terms of just putting on makeup and chatting about what has been interesting to me lately. So for context, in case you haven't heard of the book All Fours, it's basically been heralded as one of the great, maybe the first great perimenopausal novel that is charting a woman's midlife crisis at the age of 45. And it's funny, since before this book came out, I actually had not heard of Miranda July. I know a lot of people have and have seen her movies or read her books over the years, but I actually had known nothing about her. But then since this book came out, there were just so many articles in the New Yorker and the New York Times talking about how amazing this book was, how many conversations it was starting. And I was pretty skeptical at first. I'm always a little skeptical when something is really pushed, especially when it sort of feels like there's a bit of a cult of personality around the creator. But I finally folded and decided to read the free sample on Kindle for this book. And before I knew it, I was totally hooked. I finished the book in 24 hours. And then in the past week, I've also read the other novel that she came out with and her book of short stories. So I kind of went from not really knowing much about Miranda July to being a major fan in the course of a week. So just for context, that's where I am right now. And since I've been spending all of my time with my friends talking about this book, I thought it would be fun to also chat with you guys about it, and hopefully we can have a conversation as well. So for today's video, I'm not really going to talk through the makeup products as I put them on, because if you guys are familiar with my channel, you know that I can get pretty wordy when going into reviews. I like to be pretty in depth. And so if you are curious about the products on my face, definitely check out the description box. They will be linked down there. And also I do have other videos with these products going through my reviews. So if you're curious about them, you can check out those videos. But for today, I'm just going to be applying the products. These are all products I've been really loving lately, and I'll just be focused on talking about the book. For today's video, I'm going to try my best not to give too many spoilers, but if you are someone who likes to dive into a book with zero spoilers, then please go read the book before watching this video. I will give a plot summary shortly and talk about certain plot points here and there. It's probably not going to be any more spoilery than your typical review article, but just want to put that out there in case you really don't want to know what ends up happening. So let's go ahead and get started with today's look and with talking about the book's plot. So basically, it's a very interesting setup because the protagonist is someone who is very similar to Miranda July. So if you're not familiar with her, she is a filmmaker, a writer, and a performance and conceptual artist. So a lot of what makes her really well known is the fact that she has achieved a lot of success in multiple media. And that is the case for her character as well. So her character is 45, which is the age Miranda was when she started writing this novel. And she lives in Los Angeles with her husband and her non-binary child. And the way she describes herself is semi-famous. So she has some really ardent fans, but she's not necessarily someone that is easily recognizable by everyone on the street. And at the beginning of the novel, she is going on a cross-country road trip. So the way this all started was she got $20,000 kind of randomly for a line that she had written in the past that ended up being used for an ad. And so she decides to splurge on that, stay in a really fancy hotel in New York for a few nights. And then there happens to be a conversation between her husband and another woman at a party where he talks about how there are two types of people in the world. There are parkers and there are drivers. And the idea is that a driver is someone who's able to appreciate the everyday things in life. They can kind of just enjoy living in the moment. Whereas a parker is someone who needs to be in very high stress, intense situations where if they do something well, they might achieve applause. But in between that, they're kind of just living in a malaise of disappointment. And so this really affects the protagonist, and she decides instead of flying to New York like she was originally intending, she's going to do a cross-country road trip to kind of prove to herself that she can be a driver and to be more similar to her husband. So her husband is a driver and she is a parker. And she kind of feels like it's better to be a parker, someone who can kind of enjoy the everyday things and is not just living from one achievement to another. But 30 miles into this cross-country road trip, she ends up taking a pit stop at a gas station, and that ends up derailing her whole trip. She decides to actually stay the whole 2.5-week period in a motel that's basically 30 miles away from her home. And she ends up renovating that motel room and falling in love with a young man who works at the local Hertz. And so he is a young, aspiring dancer who is very attractive. He's in his early 30s, and he is a fan of her work. And this ends up kind of blowing up her whole life to some extent. So it ends up leading to her and her husband romantically separating and opening up their marriage. So that's the kind of basic plot of the story. Of course, there's much more than that. I will say, though, this book is really, really hard to spoil, because even if you are provided a very detailed plot summary, the enjoyment of the book is not so much in just the plot itself, but in Miranda July's writing style. So what I really love about her style, and this is not just in this book, but in her other fiction writing as well, is that it's a really unique combination of super smart, super funny, sexy, and weird at the same time. So it manages to, often within the same paragraph, hit on all 4 of those quadrants, which is really impressive. You'll like start a paragraph and it'll be very existential, really deep, and then it'll be laugh out loud funny at the end. And I don't often laugh out loud literally when I'm reading books, but I was really impressed with how often I did that for this book. So it's really a tribute to her writing style, that even though the book's themes are about mortality, lust, fidelity, what it means to live a good life, there's kind of all these things: intimacy, belonging, loneliness. These are all very deep and often very dark subjects. But despite that, the book is very enjoyable to read. It's very easy to read. It kind of, I think of it sort of as a really nice champagne. So very fizzy, very easy to drink, very celebratory and joyous ultimately, very life-affirming ultimately. But there's a lot of depth and layers to it as well. So it's not just like fun, sparkling wine. There is a lot of complexity to it as well. And I think that's why it's been such a hit, because there's so many layers to unpack in terms of not only the story itself, but the kinds of conversations it can evoke. So speaking about conversations, let's get into that now. So what I thought was so great about this book was it dealt with a lot of topics that I feel like haven't been represented much in mass media, but are so important and so universal. So first off, let's talk about perimenopause. So this is something that I feel almost embarrassed to say that I basically knew nothing about before. So I'm in my 30s, so this is kind of like the next phase of my life that I'll be going through. But despite that, I feel like I had never really thought about it. So one thing that Miranda July has said in relation to this book is that it's kind of interesting if you think about media representations of women and kind of what we are told to care about in our lives. Basically, there's a few major milestones in a woman's life that kind of dominate the media portrayals. So we have puberty, we have sort of the debutante or kind of coming of age period. We have engagements and getting married and then having kids. So those are all periods of life that there's a ton of media coverage of. There's a lot of focus and honestly a lot of pressure as well, especially when we start talking about marriage and having kids. But then in terms of after that, it's sort of like just a wide open space. Like what even is the next milestone after that? There's, of course, a lot of milestones related to the children and their lives. And then there's retirement, though even retirement is something that is mostly portrayed as being a very male thing, since historically a lot of women did not necessarily have long careers. And then after that, it's maybe becoming a grandmother and then death. So there's really, after the period of having kids, not a whole lot afterward in terms of what happens in a woman's life. And in this story, our protagonist is kind of realizing that she's basically at this midpoint of her life. So let's say she lives to the age of 90, then she's basically at that center point at the moment at the age of 45. And when she's diagnosed with perimenopause, that leads her to kind of freak out because she sees this chart of sex hormones and she sees that for estrogen, it basically goes up when girls hit puberty and then it sort of plateaus and then it falls down around the age she is at the moment, so late 40s. And in contrast, men's testosterone levels are pretty even, just kind of gently tapering off in old age. So that realization really throws her into this midlife crisis, which has kind of not gotten many deep portrayals in media. So I think the stereotype of a midlife crisis is a middle-aged man goes and buys a red sports car. But that kind of portrayal really doesn't have that much depth and also is very male-centric. Like, what's the equivalent for a woman? And so that's what I find so fascinating about this story, because like at a time when women of that age are typically just sort of pushed into the shadows, the protagonist in this book is really front and center. And not only is her crisis something that's very relatable, even for folks who are not perimenopausal women like myself, but also she's very much portrayed as a sexual being. So that's something that we also don't see many portrayals of, especially for older women. And as a side note, I probably should have said this earlier, but if you're someone who doesn't like a lot of explicit content in your books, I would not recommend this. This is definitely a very adult book that deals a lot with themes of sexuality. And in terms of sexuality, one thing that I thought was really interesting in terms of some of the interviews that I saw Miranda July do around this book is how she talked about perimenopause being sort of like the later stage version of puberty, and in that it's a major hormonal event. And in our culture, we have a lot of rituals and romanticization of puberty. So if you turn on the radio, pretty much any top 40 song is going to be about romance in that sort of early stage of life. So we really romanticize that. There's a lot of ritual around it. There's a lot of fixation around that period of life. And we kind of don't have anything equivalent to help people process perimenopause or menopause. So the way I kind of think of it is it's sort of like puberty is spring and perimenopause is fall, and there's really everything is very focused on that spring period, even though fall is just as colorful, but we don't really see as much in terms of the media about this. And I thought that was a really interesting insight because it's so important to have rituals especially kind of cultural rituals that are shared across the community to process major life events. Like, I don't know about you all, but for me, one thing that was really hard about COVID and the wind down of COVID was it kind of was like one day this crazy thing happened to all of us and we were all in lockdown, and then one day it just stopped and there wasn't really like much ritual or ceremony around any of that. It just sort of happened and then it disappeared. And it's not like we have COVID Remembrance Day or that there's even, one day that is the day we can point to as being the end of the pandemic. I mean, I know it technically is still not over. There still are folks getting COVID and such, but, life has mostly turned back to normal in most places. So to me, that's one thing that has been really hard about processing COVID. Everyone's just sort of on their own in terms of what happened in that phase of life and processing those changes. And so it was interesting to me to think about how this is also the case with perimenopause, but on arguably a wider scale because it's not so time delimited to a specific period of history. Instead, women are constantly going through this transition in life. And what really freaks the narrator out when she looks at this sort of drop off in estrogen, which is also why there's a cliff on the cover of the book, is that she spends the first act of the book basically kind of grappling with her feelings for this younger man, this like lust and love that she has for him, and trying to repress that to kind of move on with her life. But once she realizes that her estrogen levels will soon be plummeting, and with that possibly her libido, sex drive, and enjoyment of sex, she suddenly feels like she's in a crisis and needs to go in the opposite direction and needs to kind of make the most of life and love and sex while she still can. And what's interesting to me about this is it's not just this issue of sex and sexuality and lust and all that. It's a more existential sort of feeling as well, because basically she's been kind of trucking along in life, like meeting all these milestones, being pretty successful in her home life and in her career. And in theory, everything's going super well. There's a famous pop singer that she's really excited to meet with and who she has this meeting to talk about possible collaborations with. You can think of this pop singer as kind of being like Rihanna, since that's someone that Miranda July did meet with in real life at the restaurant that her character is supposed to meet with the pop singer at in the book. So things are going pretty well in terms of those objective measures. But at the same time, she sort of feels like dead and lost inside. Kind of like she's sort of going through the motions. There's a part where she talks about this cycle of grit and release, where she's sort of just working very hard between things to get these projects done. And then there's that momentary release when something is published or finished in terms of her projects. And then she can breathe a sigh of relief until the next one. But she's not necessarily living in between. And her marriage, even though her husband is really a perfectly nice guy in many ways, they're at a point where it really feels like they're just going through the motions of their relationship rather than really being together or feeling that sense of oneness. At one point, the narrator talks about this idea of tunneling, that it's sort of like they are both tunneling and trying to meet each other, but it's unclear if they're actually tunneling towards each other or away from each other. The premise, of course, is that they're going towards each other and will one day meet, but what if they never meet, or what if they actually end up finding someone else along the way? And I think this sort of existential dread that the character has is very relatable, because I think we all reach a certain point in life where we realize we've kind of been just operating on a lot of assumptions as we've been plowing ahead. There's a lot of things we've been doing just to get by, just to survive, just to meet societal expectations. And that's fine and dandy to some extent, but then at a certain point you realize that a lot of time in your life has passed, and then the question becomes, what do you have time left for, and what are you going to do to make the most of that? And it's sort of a scary time, middle age, when you realize that there's certain things that you might not be able to do anymore. It might just be too late. And let me actually bring you guys closer for this eyeshadow portion. And so that kind of feeling is what really motivates the author to also reach out to all of her friends and learn more about their experiences with perimenopause and also how their marriages and relationships are. So another major theme within this book is the challenges of making sort of traditional marriage structures work in the modern day. And one thing that Miranda July also talks about in a lot of interviews around this book is that in her career, she always felt like she could kind of choose her own adventure. Like part of why she is a multimedia artist is because she never felt like she had to play by the rules and only do one thing. She could sort of do what she wanted and make a career that was a good fit for her. But for some reason, until she started writing this book, she had never really thought of taking that sort of approach with her home life, like trying to create something that was more tailor-made and bespoke to her own needs. But interestingly enough, even though the protagonist does end up technically opening her marriage, you don't actually see at any point a representation of anyone having multiple sexual partners at the same time. So what ends up happening is she and her husband end their romantic relationship. So they remain roommates and co-parents, but each of them gets their own girlfriend. But this book is also not like a huge ringing endorsement for everyone to go and open up their marriages or pursue polyamorous relationships. It does reflect a lot of the challenges of creating these sorts of new structures. So at one point, for example, the narrator is having a panic attack and she realizes she can't actually call any of her partners. So she's in a new relationship with a woman who lives in London, and so the time zone really doesn't work out. Also, because it's a new relationship, she's not super comfortable reaching out to her. And then her husband is off camping with his girlfriend, and so she doesn't want to disturb the time that they have together. And so fortunately, she does have a best friend who she can call in that situation. But it does show some of the challenges when you don't have that one person that's kind of your person full time. And one thing that actually surprised me about this book when I read it is that even though a lot of the articles about it sort of frame it in terms of inspiring women to blow up their lives, I actually felt like the book itself was much more about achieving self-love and self-acceptance than necessarily prescribing a certain way to live your life in terms of how to have your relationship structures be. Since ultimately, for the protagonist, she ends up in a better place by the end of the book, but not because of her romantic relationships necessarily being amazing, but instead because she's at a place of greater self-love, acceptance, and openness to the world. Going back though to this theme of female sexuality, that was something that I found really fascinating about this book, because in general I feel like we don't have that many portrayals where the woman is the one who is really lusting after the man. For portrayals where there is an age gap, typically the age gap is in the direction of the man being much older than the woman. So that was another thing that I thought was really fascinating about this book. It made me think about what kinds of media portrayals I've seen of middle-aged women, and I feel like there's basically a few options. So there's the middle-aged woman who is really beautiful and well-preserved, basically could pass for being in her 30s. And these sorts of women can remain highly visible in the public eye. They're still sort of paraded around and looked upon as being really lovely, and also are still viewed as sexual beings, often with beautiful male partners as well, some of whom are younger than them. And then there's the sort of professional, serious woman who is middle-aged or older. So these women are still very much in the public eye because they are doing very important things, are very successful professionally. But there's sort of a masculinization and desexualization of them. So they generally wear kind of very professional, masculine looking suits, and they are not viewed as being sexual beings. So that's sort of the other type. And then the third type is basically the mom type, so like the middle-aged woman who is never really in the forefront. She is either not portrayed, or if she's portrayed, it's typically as someone's mother. So maybe in a Bildungsroman where she is a character that motivates or influences the protagonist, but is not the protagonist herself. And she's also desexualized as part of this. So it's kind of rare to have that combination of a woman who is portrayed as being middle-aged, like that is a core identity. It's not like she looks or is interpreted as being a younger woman, but she still has a public persona and also a sexual persona. So that was really fascinating to me. It's almost sort of like a taboo thing that the novel goes into, even though if you think about it, it's really unfair that women have those three options basically. And most women don't even have those three options because not everyone can be super famous or successful. And it's actually kind of funny because Miranda July in some interviews talked about how she almost hesitated writing this perimenopausal novel because she didn't really want her brand to be basically the perimenopausal woman. Like, she was aware of how much that would just lead her to be kind of typecast. But I think it's cool that she's taking that step and challenging these notions and broadening what it means to be a middle-aged woman. All right, so here is the finished makeup look. What do you guys think? Apologies if you saw me sweating a ton during this. It's a very hot day where I live and I don't have AC, so it was a little bit of a challenge to film this, and definitely my brows and some other aspects of this look are not as refined as I would like. But hopefully this was still a fun video for you guys, and I'm just adding some inner corner and brow bone highlight as I'm doing this from this palette. Let me actually add a little bit of cheek highlight as well. Sorry, I always forget about highlighter until like the very end, typically after I've already said that's the finished look. Okay, so here we have the real finished look. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I really loved this book and haven't been able to stop talking about it since I read it. And so I hope that you guys enjoy this as well. I would love to hear in the comments, if you do read it, what your thoughts are, or if you've consumed any other works from Miranda July. I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. And also, since this book is really about starting conversations, I've had so many great conversations with friends about this book since it came out. I would also just love to hear about your guys' experiences, especially if you're going through perimenopause yourself. For me, part of what was so revelatory about this book is that even though I'm only a decade off from perimenopause, I feel like I just didn't really know much, if anything, about it before reading this book, and that just felt like a huge blind spot. And I'm just so glad that this conversation is getting more traction and more people are talking about this phase of life. And especially, I felt like it would be fun to share this book with you guys on my channel, since at least for me, makeup and beauty is really tied to how I express my femininity as well. And especially as I get older, I find a lot of joy in taking time for myself to put on makeup, to revel in the looks that I can create. And it's not for me at this point so much about looking a certain way for other people. It's really just about the artistry and enjoyment for myself. And that for me has been a really positive development as I've gotten older. Definitely in my 20s, I was a lot more concerned about how other people perceived me. And so I would love to hear about your guys' experiences with these life transitions as well. I feel like so many of these things are happening to everyone, but we don't really have a good place or a way to talk about them. So I would definitely love to engage more in these conversations, and let me know if you guys would be interested in more content in this vein as well. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!